Okay, this is lesson 3.6. This is the quadratic formula. Now all you guys are going to have to do is apply the formula, and I'll show you an example of that at the very end. It's going to replace completing the square and factoring as your go-to method to solving quadratic equations. But before you apply it, I want to show you how it's derived and where it comes from. In order to do that, I'm going to put two cars on the screen. So here I have two cars, and they're going to solve basically the same problem. The red car is going to solve a problem based in numbers, so I have 2x squared plus 6x plus 1 equals 0. The green car is going to solve the same problem, but instead of 2, 6, and 1, we have a, b, and c. So I'm going to do the steps on the right first, and then duplicate the same step over on the left. Now what's important to remember is that this only works, and the quadratic formula only works, if the whole equation equals 0 and everything else is on the left-hand side. So before we even get to this part, we have to move everything to the left-hand side of the equation. So we're going to do completing the square to solve 2x squared plus 6x plus 1. And when we do that, the first step is to get x squared with a coefficient of 1. So we divide everything by 2. So 2x squared divided by 2 is x divided by 2 is 3, 1 divided by 2 is a half. And on the left-hand side, I can't divide by 2, I have to divide by a. So ax squared divided by 2 is x squared, bx divided by 2 is b over a x, and c divided by 2 is c over a. And of course, on both sides, 0 divided by 2 is 0, and 0 divided by a is also 0. So now I have to get that term, that 1/2 on the right-hand side. I want to move it to the other side of the equation. So I just subtract 1/2 from both sides. It becomes x squared plus 3x equals negative 1/2. Now on the one with the letters, we're going to subtract the third term away, but it's going to be minus c over a. So we have x squared plus b over a x equals negative c over a. Those are exactly the same equations that I left off with on the last page. Now I need to complete the square, which means I take the x term, divide by 2, square it, and then add that to both sides. Okay, again, we take the middle term, take the coefficient, divide by 2, square it, and add it to both sides. That's the process of completing the square. So in this case, with the numbers, it's 3 over 2, so we add 3 over 2 squared to both sides. And on this case, b over a divided by 2, well, divide by 2 is the same thing as multiply times a half. So b over a becomes b over 2a. So I have b over 2a squared to both sides. Now I'm going to have to clean this up a little. On the right-hand side, the whole purpose of doing that is so we can factor. And so we factor the left-hand side, and it becomes x plus 3 over 2 squared. And we square the fraction on the right-hand side, so that becomes 9 over 4. And on the left-hand side, we get x plus b over 2a squared. And then on the right-hand side, we have to square the fraction. That becomes b squared plus 4a squared. We square everything when we square a fraction. Now I want to combine. Again, I want to combine the fractions that are on the right-hand side. So in order to do that, I have to get a common denominator. On the one with the numbers, the common denominator is 4, which means I have to multiply the top and bottom by 1/2 by 2. On the left-hand side with the numbers, the common denominator is 4a squared. So I'll have to take the second fraction and multiply it by 4a on the bottom to get 4a squared, which means I have to multiply it by 4a on the top as well. So you'll see the left-hand side of the equation didn't change, and neither did the b squared over 4a squared, but now I have 4ac over 4a squared. Now since I have a common denominator, I'll just add the tops. Now when we do subtract the tops as it is. When we have the number 1, that becomes 7 over 4. When we have the letter 1, that becomes b squared minus 4ac over 4a squared. The next step is to take the square root of each side. When I do that with the letters, I get x plus 3 over 2 equals root 7 over 4. And when I do it with the numbers, do it with the letters, I get x plus b over 2a equals the square root of b squared minus 4ac over 4a squared. When I take a square root, I take the square root of the top of that fraction separate from the bottom of the fraction. So this becomes plus or minus root 7. Remember, when we take a square root, it's plus or minus over 2. And on the left-hand side, it becomes plus or minus square root of b squared minus 4ac over 2a. Almost there, I promise. See, there's the house. They're getting home. So now we just need to get the x by itself. So on the right one, we will subtract 3 over 2 from both sides, and on the left one we'll subtract b over 2a from both sides. That'll get the x by itself, and we combine the fractions. When we combine the fractions to the right, we get negative 3 plus or minus root 7 over 2, and we combine the fractions on the right, we get this thing. Negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. That is the quadratic formula. You should write it down. You should memorize it. You should write it at the top of your homework whenever you do it. This is extremely important. When you have a quadratic equation, you can use a, b, and c, plug them into that formula, and you get what x equals. That's without factoring. That's without completing the square. This formula gives you the answer. X is equal to negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. Now to apply it. So say I have this equation, 3x squared minus 5x plus 2 equals 0. Well, in this case, a is 3, b is negative 5, and c is 2. So I just plug those in. I'm going to use parentheses whenever I plug in. It's going to make my life a lot easier. So I have negative b, which is negative 5, plus or minus the square root of negative 5, because it's b squared, minus 4 times 3, which is a, times 2, which is c, all over 2 times 3, which is a. Now, one thing to remember is the order of operations still applies. We're not changing the way we're doing math. But one caveat to that is that the long radical bar functions the same way as a parentheses. So you have to do 5 squared minus 4 times 3 times 2 before you add that to the negative 5. That long bar on top is just like a fraction. Everything is stuck in there, just like it's stuck in parentheses. I didn't say fraction, I meant parentheses. So in this case, negative 5 is positive 5. Negative 5 squared is 25. 4 times 3 times 2 is negative 24, because it's negative 4 times 3, which is 12. Negative 12, which times 2, which is negative 24. All over 2 times 3. Well, in that case, that's 5 plus or minus the square root of 1, because 25 minus 24 is 1. Over 6, the square root of 1 is 1. So we get x is equal to 5 plus or minus 1 over 6. Now you have to remember that this is two different answers. This is 5 plus 1 divided by 6, as well as 5 minus 1 divided by 6. If it's 5 plus 1 divided by 6, 5 plus 1 is 6. 6 divided by 6 is 1, so that's one of the answers. 5 minus 1 is 5 minus 1 is 4. 4 divided by 6 is 2/3. That's another one of the answers. So the answer here is either 1 or it's 2/3. So here's the homework, and I want you to remember two things before getting started. The first thing is that before you use the quadratic formula, you have to move everything to one side of the equation and combine like terms. You have to have ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. And second, if you end up having to take the square root of a negative number, then the answer is no real solutions. I notice I didn't say no solutions. I said no real solutions. We'll talk about what that means on Wednesday.